Canada has been expelled from the North American Strategic Trade and Security Framework. Not suspended, not downgraded, not placed on probationary review, while terms were renegotiated. Expelled formally, publicly, by executive order of the sitting American president with immediate effect. The 31-year agreement that integrated energy grids, critical mineral supply chains, defense procurement, intelligence sharing, and over $2 billion in daily cross-border trade was torn apart in 4 pages. And within 72 hours, the move backfired so catastrophically that 3 American border state governors declared economic emergencies. The Dow dropped over 900 points in a single session, and Canadian officials began signing provisional trade agreements with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and India. Deals that had been blocked for years by the very exclusivity provisions Trump just destroyed. Canada watched as the White House framed the expulsion as a response to its failure to demonstrate adequate commitment to American priorities. But the executive order's language was strikingly blunt. It accused Canada of exploiting the framework's provisions to resist legitimate American security requirements. There was no 60-day consultation period required under Article 22 of the framework's own charter, no advance warning to Congress, no consultation with the American industries that depended on Canadian energy, Canadian minerals, and Canadian manufacturing integration. International law scholars immediately condemned the move as a breach of treaty obligations. A former United Nations Secretary General called it the most significant unilateral abrogation of a bilateral treaty by a major democracy in the post-war era. But for Canada, the legal fight was never the primary concern. The primary concern was what came next, and how fast it arrived. Canada had been, inside the framework, the silent engine of the American economy. Before the expulsion, Canada supplied 61% of all crude oil imported by the United States, 38% of natural gas imports to northern states, and 97% of electricity imports for border communities from Maine to Washington state. The framework's grid synchronization protocols had allowed power to flow seamlessly across the border for decades, preventing blackouts during extreme weather and providing redundancy for 14 American states through every winter storm, every summer heat wave, every grid emergency. Those protocols were terminated by the stroke of a pen, not reduced, not renegotiated, terminated. Within 48 hours, grid operators in New England, the Upper Midwest, and the Pacific Northwest activated emergency protocols they had never used outside of simulation exercises, warning of potential rolling blackouts during what forecasters were already calling one of the coldest winters in 15 years. Natural gas prices in the Upper Midwest surged 43% within 10 days as pipeline flow agreements reverted from framework terms to spot market pricing. The governor of Michigan stood in front of an auto plant that had reduced shifts due to energy cost spikes and said, "We are watching the president dismantle the economic foundation of this region in real time. The framework wasn't a Canadian benefit, it was an American lifeline, and we just cut it ourselves." But the pressure wasn't building on Canada. The pressure was building on Detroit, on Buffalo, on Seattle, on every American city wired into Canadian supply chains so deeply that most people had forgotten the wiring was even there. Canada's critical minerals told an even starker story. Canada is the primary or sole North American source of nickel, cobalt, potash, uranium, lithium, and 17 of the 23 rare earth elements that the Pentagon classifies as essential to national defense. The framework's mineral supply chain provisions had guaranteed American defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics priority access to Canadian extraction at stable, pre-negotiated prices. Without the framework, those minerals became available on the open market, where China controls 67% of global rare earth processing and where prices are set not by bilateral agreement, but by whoever is willing to pay the most. A leaked Pentagon internal memo within the first week warned that the termination of framework mineral supply provisions created an immediate vulnerability in 7 active weapons procurement programs and introduced unacceptable supply chain risk to multiple major defense platforms. The memo recommended immediate engagement with Canadian authorities to establish emergency mineral supply agreements outside the framework structure, a recommendation that amounted to asking Canada to voluntarily restore, at Canada's discretion and Canada's price, access that America had just unilaterally revoked. The irony was not lost on anyone in Ottawa. A senior Canadian trade official speaking anonymously said, "They kicked us out on Monday. They're asking us back on Friday, but the price has changed." Canada, for the first time in 3 decades, was free to sell to the highest bidder. The auto industry collapse was the consequence that hit closest to home for the largest number of Americans. Canada's manufacturing integration under the framework was so deep that a single vehicle crossed the U.S.-Canada border an average of 7 times during production. Engines manufactured in Ontario were shipped to assembly plants in Michigan, transmissions built in Indiana using Canadian aluminum, wiring harnesses assembled in Quebec. The framework's regulatory harmonization meant that these crossings happened seamlessly. Same safety standards, same emission certification, same customs processing, same quality protocols. The executive order shattered that integration overnight. Every crossing now required independent inspection, separate certification, new customs documentation, and compliance with 2 divergent regulatory systems instead of one harmonized framework. The Auto Alliance estimated the cost at $11,000 per vehicle, an extra $900 on the average car or truck sold in the United States within 6 months. Within 2 weeks, 3 major assembly plants in Michigan and Ohio announced temporary shutdowns, not because of demand issues, not because of labor disputes, but because parts that had crossed the border seamlessly under framework harmonization were now stuck in customs processing that added days to delivery times and thousands of dollars to per-vehicle costs. Ford issued a statement calling the framework termination the most significant disruption to North American automotive manufacturing since the pandemic. General Motors estimated a per-vehicle cost increase of $12,000 if the framework was not restored within 90 days. The United Auto Workers issued a statement that cut through the corporate language. "Our members are being sent home because the president decided to blow up the system that kept their plants running. These aren't layoffs. These are casualties of a policy that nobody in this industry asked for, nobody in this industry wanted, and nobody in this industry can survive." And Canada? Canada began rerouting supply chains to Europe and Asia within days. Then Mark Carney responded. The Canadian Prime Minister had spent months responding to American pressure with cold strategic precision. Counter tariffs, diversification strategy rollouts, Arctic framework press conferences. But this time was different. He called an emergency joint session of Parliament convened on emergency notice. Every seat was filled. The galleries were packed. Diplomatic representatives from 23 nations sat in the visitors' gallery. An unprecedented number assembled not because they were invited, but because they understood that what was about to happen in that chamber would set the terms for every alliance on Earth. Carney walked to the podium without notes. He stood for a moment in silence, looking out at the assembled members, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and absolutely steady. He spoke first to Canadians. 31 years ago, Canada entered into a framework with the United States based on a simple principle, that 2 nations could build something together that neither could build alone. For 31 years, that principle held. Canadian energy powered American homes. Canadian minerals built American weapons. Canadian workers assembled American cars. Canadian ports moved American goods. Canadian intelligence protected American cities. We did this not as subordinates, but as partners, because partnership is how democracies relate to each other, through mutual benefit, mutual respect, and mutual sovereignty. He paused. Yesterday, the President of the United States ended that partnership, not because Canada violated its terms, not because the framework failed, but because Canada refused to accept terms that would have made partnership indistinguishable from submission. And so, we were expelled. The temperature in the room shifted. Let me be clear about what has happened and what has not happened. What has happened is that the United States has unilaterally destroyed the most productive bilateral economic relationship in human history. What has not happened is that Canada has been diminished. We are the same country today that we were yesterday. We have the same energy, the same minerals, the same ports, the same workers, the same geography, the same 2 coastlines, the same Arctic frontier, and the same resources that the rest of the world is now lining up to access. Nothing has been taken from us. Something has been taken from the United States, our partnership, and that is their loss far more than it is ours. Then he turned to the camera, and his voice, still quiet, carried an edge that landed like a blade in every room it reached. To the President of the United States, you have expelled Canada from a framework that Canada helped build, that Canada sustained, and that Canada's resources made valuable. You did this believing it would bring us to our knees. You did this believing we would come back diminished, ready to accept whatever terms you dictated. You did this because you confused our partnership with your leverage. He stopped. The silence in the chamber was total. Then came 7 words spoken with the finality of a door closing and a lock turning. You didn't remove us. You removed yourself. The chamber erupted. Every member of Parliament was on their feet. The ovation lasted over 90 seconds. Not the performative applause of political theater, but the sound of a nation recognizing that the words just spoken had permanently redefined its position in the world. You didn't remove us, you removed yourself was trending globally within 6 minutes. Within 30 minutes, it was the lead story on every major news network in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The Financial Times ran it as a banner headline. Japan's NHK interrupted regular programming. France's Le Monde published a special edition. International media called it the 7 words that inverted a superpower. Negotiation professors at Harvard, Wharton, and INSEAD began drafting case studies before Carney had left the podium. What made those 7 words so devastating was not their rhetorical force, but their accuracy. Inside the framework, Canada had been constrained. The framework's exclusivity provisions had limited Canada's ability to sign preferential trade agreements with non-member nations. The regulatory harmonization locked Canadian standards to American specifications. The energy integration committed Canadian supply to American demand at prices negotiated within the framework, prices consistently below global market rates. The mineral supply chain provisions gave American defense contractors priority access ahead of competing buyers from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The framework was, from Canada's perspective, a ceiling as much as a floor. It guaranteed access to the American market, but it also prevented Canada from fully accessing the global market, where Canadian resources commanded significantly higher prices and attracted significantly more competitive offers. Trump tore up the ceiling. The moment the executive order took effect, every constraint that had kept Canada locked into American favorable terms vanished. Canadian oil, previously committed to American refineries at framework rates, was now available to the highest global bidder, and the highest global bidder was not the United States. Canadian critical minerals, previously channeled to American defense contractors at pre-negotiated prices, were now available to European and Asian manufacturers willing to pay 30 to 40% more. Canadian ports, previously integrated into American logistics chains with priority American cargo access, were now free to restructure their operations around whichever trading partners offered the best terms. The framework had been America's lock on Canadian economic independence. Trump had just picked the lock himself from the inside and handed Canada the key. Within 1 week, Canada signed provisional trade memoranda with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia. The EU agreement alone, fast-tracked through emergency provisions that bypassed the usual multi-year negotiation timeline, opened European markets to Canadian energy exports at prices 22% above what American buyers had been paying under the framework. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry announced a $2.3 billion investment in Canadian rare earth processing facilities, the exact kind of investment that framework exclusivity provisions had previously blocked. India signed a critical minerals partnership that gave Indian manufacturers access to Canadian lithium and cobalt, commodities that American battery manufacturers had assumed were exclusively theirs. The EU's trade commissioner said publicly that Canada was an energy superpower, a mineral superpower, and a geographic superpower, and that the only reason European markets hadn't had full access was the framework's exclusivity provisions, and those provisions are now gone. Japan's prime minister was more direct. Canada is open. We will not hesitate. In the space of 3 weeks, Canada went from a nation locked into a single dominant trade relationship to the most courted resource partner on Earth. And every new partnership signed was a partnership that made returning to the American framework less necessary, less attractive, and less likely. Warren Buffett, watching from Omaha, delivered a response that cut through the political noise, the diplomatic statements, the market volatility, and the cascading analysis with the precision of someone who has spent 7 decades watching organizations make exactly this mistake. He did not talk about politics. He did not talk about Trump or Carney or the specific provisions of the framework. He talked about a pattern he had watched destroy partnerships, companies, supply chains, and empires. And he explained why the pattern is inescapable once the first move is made. In 70 years of business, Buffett said, I have watched every kind of mistake a leader can make. Most mistakes are recoverable. Bad strategy can be corrected. Poor execution can be improved. Even terrible timing can be survived if the fundamentals are sound. But there is one mistake that is not recoverable, and it is the mistake of firing a partner who was doing more for you than you were doing for them. Because the moment that partner is free, 2 things happen simultaneously, and both of them are devastating. First, they discover what they're actually worth on the open market, and it is always more than what you were paying them. Second, you discover what they were actually providing, and it is always more than what you thought. He applied it with surgical precision. The framework was the most lopsided deal in modern economic history, lopsided in America's favor. Canada was providing energy below global market rates, minerals below global market rates, integrated manufacturing labor below what any alternative would cost, port access, grid synchronization, intelligence sharing, Arctic logistics, all flowing south across that border at prices that reflected partnership, not market value. And the United States was receiving all of it while apparently believing it was doing Canada a favor. He let that land. That is the most dangerous delusion in business, believing you are the benefactor when you are in fact the beneficiary. Because the moment you act on that delusion, the moment you fire the partner or expel the ally or tear up the agreement, reality arrives, and reality does not negotiate. Buffett went deeper into the mechanics. I've sat across the table from CEOs who fired their most important supplier because the supplier pushed back on terms. Every single one of them told me the same thing beforehand. They need us more than we need them. And every single one of them discovered the same thing afterward. They were wrong. The supplier found new clients within weeks. The CEO spent months trying to replace what they'd lost at higher cost, lower quality, and worse terms. And by the time they realized the magnitude of the error, the supplier had moved on permanently. That is what is happening right now between the United States and Canada. Canada is signing deals with Europe and Asia at prices America never offered. America is scrambling to find alternative sources for things it assumed would flow freely forever. And every day that passes makes the realignment more permanent, because every new deal Canada signs is a deal that didn't exist before Trump created the opening. His closing was devastating in its simplicity. People ask me whether Canada will come back to the framework. The question isn't whether Canada will come back. The question is whether Canada will want to. Before the expulsion, Canada had one major trading partner and limited alternatives. After the expulsion, Canada has the European Union, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and a line of nations stretching around the world, all offering better terms than America ever did. Trump didn't kick Canada out of the framework. He kicked America out of the best deal it ever had. And the first rule of business is, when you find yourself in the best deal you've ever had, you don't tear it up, you write a thank you note. The consequences for the United States continued to compound. American domestic politics fractured along lines that had nothing to do with party and everything to do with geography and economic survival. 14 governors, 9 Republicans, 5 Democrats signed a joint letter to the White House demanding emergency framework restoration, calling the expulsion an act of economic self-sabotage causing immediate and measurable harm to American workers, American businesses, and American national security. 37 senators, including 11 Republicans, co-sponsored an emergency resolution requiring congressional approval for any future unilateral termination of bilateral frameworks, a direct rebuke to the executive authority that had made the expulsion possible. The Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers, the American Petroleum Institute, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued a joint statement, the first time all four organizations had co-signed a single document in over a decade, calling the framework termination catastrophic, unnecessary, and immediately reversible, and labeling it the most damaging, unforced error in modern American economic policy. American public opinion moved with a speed and clarity that reflected the tangible, visible, undeniable nature of the consequences. Polling conducted within 2 weeks showed 64% of Americans, including 41% of Republicans, opposed the framework termination. The number rose to 73% among respondents in border states directly affected by energy disruptions, auto plant shutdowns, and supply chain failures. 58% said they believed the expulsion had weakened America's position in the world. The most striking result was the response to a simple question: who benefited from the framework termination? 11% said the United States, 67% said Canada. The American public had arrived at the same conclusion that Buffett, the markets, the allies, the governors, and the senators had reached. Trump hadn't punished Canada. He had set them free. And freedom, it turned out, was worth more than partnership, at least when the partnership had been on someone else's terms. So here is where we stand. Canada was expelled from a 31-year framework that integrated energy, minerals, manufacturing, defense, and trade between the two largest trading partners on Earth. Within days, American border states declared energy emergencies, auto plants shut down, defense supply chains destabilized, and grid operators warned of winter blackouts. Canada responded not by seeking readmission, but by signing trade agreements with Europe, Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia. Agreements that offer better terms than America ever provided and that are making the old framework irrelevant. Mark Carney stood in Parliament, looked into the camera, and said 7 words now printed on front pages around the world: "You didn't remove us. You removed yourself." Warren Buffett explained why this was always going to happen. Because you never fire a partner who is doing more for you than you were doing for them. Because the moment they're free, they discover what they're worth. And because what they're worth is always more than what you were paying. Can the United States replace 61% of its crude oil imports, 97% of its border electricity, and the critical minerals its military depends on? If so, from where, at what cost, and on what timeline? Can a framework that took 31 years to build be reconstructed after a unilateral 72-hour demolition? Or has the integration been permanently shattered? And the question that every American ally is now asking in every capital on Earth: if the United States will tear up a 31-year partnership with its closest ally over a political grievance, what is any American agreement actually worth? And how quickly should we be building alternatives? Trump tried to punish Canada by kicking it out. Instead, he liberated Canada from the constraints that had kept it locked into American favorable terms for 3 decades. He tried to demonstrate that American power could dictate the terms of any relationship. Instead, he demonstrated that American prosperity depended on a partnership he had just destroyed. He tried to show the world what happens when a nation defies the United States. Instead, he showed the world what happens when the United States defies its own interests. And he gave Mark Carney the 7 words that will define this era, 7 words that every expelled partner understood, every remaining ally heard as a warning, and every negotiation classroom will teach as the most expensive lesson in modern economic history. You didn't remove us. You removed yourself. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.